It's my great pleasure to introduce Danielle Dolan, who is the Project Manager of Water Programs, Local Government Commission. She comes legitimately to this position. She did her graduate study looking at the Integrated Regional Water Management Program, the infamous IRWIN program, and at UC Davis did her master's thesis on that particular program. She is extremely well qualified. We are delighted to have her on staff here at LGC. And now that you've been introduced, Danielle, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. It's an honor to be here with all of you. I would like to ask our panelists to take a seat so we don't have to stand awkwardly in the corner any longer. I will introduce them to you in a moment. First, I wanted to go over a couple logistics for those of you that checked in this morning instead of last night. The bathrooms are through these double doors here at the front of the room. Take a left, and the bathrooms are down the end of the hall. The door is very squeaky, so please don't leave the room unless you need to, and close the door quietly. We had a few interruptions last night that were pretty disruptive.
I'll be handing out bathroom passes over here.
You can only leave the room with Jake's permission. You'll see from the agenda that we have a 4-hour session focused solely on water and the interconnection between water and land use today. We are thrilled to have that time to talk with you all. We have divided the session up into 2 separate but related panels, and we'll have a break in between the 2 where you can stretch your legs and your brains a bit. Before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to share with you a little bit about LGC's work in the water world. For over 35 years, we have been engaging communities at the intersect of land use, decision-making, and water management. One of the ways we have done this is through the groundbreaking Awami Water Principles, which Jake mentioned, which were drafted right here in the majestic Yosemite Valley, pun intended. And what the Awami Water Principles are is a set of land use planning strategies that help to minimize the negative impacts of land use and development on our water resources. Many of you are very familiar with those impacts. Just by example, some research from Texas A&M noted that just between 1997 and 2012, Sprawl development paved over 1 million acres of open space, much of which was prime groundwater recharge areas vital to the state's water supply. Making smarter land use decisions doesn't only protect our water resources, but it also saves us money. Consider how much it will cost us in the future if we lose our naturally replenishing low-cost groundwater now, as water becomes more scarce in the future with population growth and climate change. We need to start recharging now. The state of California pumps more groundwater than any other state in the country at 12 billion gallons a day. And we don't even know how much is under our feet. Fortunately, last year we passed the Sustainable Groundwater, actually 2014 now, we passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, which requires communities to start measuring that groundwater and provides an opportunity to employ best practices and strategies that you'll hear about today from our panelists on how to collaborate across jurisdictions and across subject areas to implement some of the ideas from the Awami Principles to ensure that our current planning documents and our land use planning decisions are aligned with these new groundwater regulations. It's absolutely critical that cities and counties engage now in this legislation and in this new development process if we're to ensure safe, reliable water supply for our communities today and in the future. We have some fabulous panelists today. First, we will hear from Judy Corbett. Judy, as you know, is the founder of the Local Government Commission. She began her career as a graduate student in ecology, helping to create the still admired 60-acre model for sustainable development in Davis called Village Homes. She then moved on to found the SolarCal Local Government Commission, which was the predecessor of LGC. She recently retired as the executive director from LGC and is now an active board member of the Planning and Conservation League, leader of the Working Landscapes Water Committee for the California Economic Summit, and on the California Stewardship Council of the American Farmland Trust. She's also newly undertaken consulting work with the PCL Foundation. Pretty busy retirement, Judy. Then we'll hear from Mayor Elizabeth Patterson. Mayor Patterson has served on the Benicia City Council since 2003. She was selected mayor in 2007 and re-elected in 2011. She also served on the Planning Commission and was chair of the General Plan Oversight Committee for 3 years, from the beginning to the end of that arduous process. Mayor Patterson currently serves on several other regional boards, including the Solano Transportation Authority Board, Trans Joint Powers Authority Board, and the Solano Water Agency Board. She's lived in Benicia since 1983 and has been involved in several regional and local issues, using conflict resolution to reach a consensus, planning and managing urban and natural resource assets. And she also works as a retired employee for the California Department of Water Resources on land use and integrated water management. I can't think of a more perfect speaker for this panel. And lastly, we'll hear from Trevor Joseph. We're thrilled to have someone from the department here with us who is an expert on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, because he's charged with implementing it and actually writing the regulations, which we're going through the process of right now. Trevor is the project manager for SIGMA implementation. He has, in the past, he's evaluated stream depletion impacts and advanced groundwater substitution transfers and conjunctive use programs. He has over 18 years of combined consulting and state experience, providing environmental and water resources consulting services to private and public sector clients and on legislative mandated programs and projects. So please turn your attention to our wonderful panelists, and I'll hand over to Judy.
Okay, lovely to be here back in Yosemite again. Welcome to you all. I think it was about 8 or 9 years ago, was it, Bob, that we first came to the Awami and began to think about Awami water principles. And actually, we had some pretty amazing people. Closer to the mic. Oh ho ho! There, we had some really incredible national and state people helping us, as well as university and local folks. Mary Nichols was involved. It's Wes Cantu, who's head of the State Water Board. And we were lucky enough for 2 years to have funding from the Water Board to just focus on water here at the Awami Hotel. When Kate asked me to talk about the Awami water principles, I took a look at them again, and I'd sort of forgotten that the most important principle that we had come up with was to look at where and how we grow. And that actually came about for us when one of our staff came across some images that were available of where the wetlands were and where the urban areas were through the years. And so you see the green area is wetlands, the red is developed, and there's where we were in 1850. And the wetlands are a primary source of groundwater supply. That's one of the places where you begin to get water seeping back into these large basins that we have underneath us that is so kindly storing water for us. And then we go up to 1900, and the wetlands have been drained a little bit, and the urban growth is beginning to go. And 1950, a little bit more, lost. And by 1990, can you believe it, we have lost those wetlands. We have covered over, am I not loud enough? Okay. So we've covered over all those special areas that were allowing us to get groundwater. Now, in some of that area inland, there in the valley, there are some very nice recharge areas. And there very recently was a study done. We've lost 60% of those through urban sprawl, only 40% remain. So definitely, without a doubt, this is the first place to look when we're worried about groundwater. We're worried about our precious water supplies, is that storage capacity that we are losing. So very early on, the US EPA sort of recognized that this was a problem and called it the greatest threat to our water resources. And figured out that where and how we grow is key. So the big effort is do not cover or contaminate areas important to groundwater recharge. Celeste Cantu is suggesting just place a big W zone in these areas, and we just really need to stop developing those areas. and do grow in a way that we've been talking about for a long time, growing in the form of compact, walkable, mixed-use communities in areas that have already disrupted the land to some extent, and especially in our downtowns as well. I was looking back since 1991 when we first came here and looked at the land use principles, and it was a new vision for growth. Back then, there was a lot of communities that are trying to stop growth because it was really destroying our communities, and our downtowns were lost. And I was stuck in traffic congestion right around Berkeley, and we were growing quickly, and the only way we knew how to grow was sprawl. And it seemed like we need to figure out some additional way to address this problem other than widening freeways, which the city of Berkeley, Lonnie Hancock was with the LGC at that time, and she was like, no way, no how are they going to expand that freeway through my city. So the first reason that we approached this issue was because of traffic congestion. So I was looking for, well, okay, so we're going to do a whole new vision of how we're going to grow, and how in the heck do we even start? So I went to talk to Mary Nichols, who was working on transportation down in the LA area with a foundation. And she said, well, you know, this is really all about air quality, that the more we grow, the more air emissions we have, and that's been a major source of problem for the air board. So she sent me to this lovely woman at the air board who said, yeah, we could do that. So she funded the principles, and she funded our first 2 years here. Well, I began to get kind of nostalgic about this time, as you can tell, and I was thinking, why do we love the Awami Principles so much? And why have we come back here for 25 years and found some other reason to embrace them and talk about them? So the first one was traffic congestion. The second one was the air quality. And then when we went out and took the principles, thanks to a lot of Air Sources Board, not board, but air districts, to sponsor these events for their communities, and thank you, Larry Green was one of them with the Yellow Solano Air District. And we would present the principles, and people would really embrace them. And you'd ask why, and they'd say, well, it brings back our downtown, it brings back the kind of town we used to be. It's really about quality of life for us. So that was another reason that we love the Awami Principles. And then about 2 years after we started working on these statewide conferences, I had a couple of consultants come in from Silicon Valley who said, we've done a paper on why the Awami Principles and that kind of growth is really appropriate to the new economy. And the reason is because you need to bring silos of people together from different professions. Take Steve Wozniak, the engineer, and take our other man who is the designer, and great things happen. And this happens in town centers where people get together kind of on a daily basis and brainstorm, and new things happen. So we started economic development principles, and that was another reason we loved the Awami Principles. And then along comes the Centers for Disease Control and a guy named Dick Jackson, who began to think of, you know, we've got this obesity crisis, it is absolutely out of control, and why and what is happening and how can we stop it? Public health officials definitely, when they see a crisis happening, they are ready to move, they don't stand around. So the public health community really embraced our Awami Principles because it allowed people to walk and take transit and incorporate walking and biking into their daily lives. So that kept us going for a long time, working on public health issues. And then not too long ago, we had a couple of speakers, it's probably 10 years ago, who came into the Awami conference and told us that global warming was of course happening, and that probably one of the major impacts of this was going to be water in California. And so we began to focus on this through greenhouse gas emissions, and Kate has really picked that one up and made the local government commission a leader in this issue. And finally, we cycle back to where we started from, which is water, and the understanding that, oh my goodness, the way that we're growing, absolutely covering over the most important resource, most precious resource that we have, which is groundwater supplies. If we can do better use of development land and save that special land that is so important to our future, then that will be really going a long way in terms of addressing the water issue. So probably the favorite thing about the Awami Principles has been that I get to come back here 25 years in a row. But it's been quite a ride, and I think about when we first started this, it didn't seem like we could possibly be coming back here for 25 years in a row talking about the same thing. Yet every year we come up with a new issue that was actually related to the Awami Principles, and another reason for you folks to come out and learn about that and to do things in your communities. And you really have, incredibly. Back to the water principles, you've been looking at conserving, reusing, and recycling water, and all of these techniques were known about way back then, but local governments have been inventing new ways in the last couple of years since the crisis. And this has allowed some of you to reduce your water use as much as 33%. So we know those are really important in terms of reducing the size of the straw that's pulling the water out of the groundwater supplies. But there's more that you folks have done over the years in terms of doing general plan changes, form-based codes, and other zoning tools, transit, biking, and have really made an amazing difference in what our communities look like over the last 25 years. These, I think, are mostly images from Sacramento. Thank you. Our Sacramento represents. Okay, and I stuck Jerry Brown in there because Jerry giveth and Jerry taketh away. What Jerry has given us is SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And to me, it's like SB 375 was, only it's got more teeth. And you'll hear more about how SGMA, I think, is going to stop this freight train of sprawl that we've been experiencing and that we've actually addressed over the 25 years. And I think because of the importance of SGMA that we may be able to just stop that sprawl train forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy, for that very illustrative history lesson on the Awami Water Principles and reminding us of where we came from and why we continue to come back. And just to illustrate how the Awami Principles continue to evolve, we did just update one chapter in the Awami Water Principles Guidebook, which was my first project at LGC, and we published a new fact sheet on stormwater, which is in your packets as well. And next we get to hear from Mayor Elizabeth Patterson, and she'll give us some more insight on what specifically cities can do in regard to land use planning and sustainable groundwater management.
So, Tony? Can you hear me? Yes. My mother never complained, but you never hear me. Speaking of my mother, I was born in Los Angeles, as was my mother. I have lots of stories to tell about our experience with lots of rainwater and going down Peck Road, and anybody knows that area, having an old car that would drive above the water and all the new cars would get drowned. So there were advantages to being poor and having an old car. But my real beginning career in dealing with water management was when I was in college. I was living in a rental up in a canyon in Sierra Madre, and Frank G. Benelli decided that he needed to build a dam and drown all of the residences up in the canyon in order to protect the residences that had been built later on down in the floodplain. We won. That's a short version of that fairly long and interesting story. So it's still that canyon's still there. Another thought that I wanted to share with you is I was really inspired by Carl Gardino last night, and how he took what Judy was saying, all these different components of communities, and they sounded like they were different efforts, but if you put them all together, it makes a community. Water is the essence of life, and so in being able to unify all the things that we do in a community means that we actually are protecting the very one thing that we need to protect as water. If you don't think it's precious, I want you to think about this fact. It was at the end of the movie Big Short, and it said that Dr. Berry, the guy that identified the housing market issue, the crazy hard rock guy, he is now into water futures. This is a former neurosurgeon who made billions of dollars because of the housing market. Okay, so here we are. Surface water equals groundwater. I want you to keep this concept. Go home with it. You might even just kind of pray every night. Surface water equals groundwater. I work a lot with local folks, and there is a real disjunction between that concept. What I really want to talk about today is connecting water management and land use planning, and applying land use tools for sustainable groundwater management planning, which we're right in the midst of doing. And then also a specific tool that we developed at DWR to help local decision makers make decisions that benefit water supply and resources in a cost-effective and sustainable manner. So this is the shortest version you will ever see of water rights in California. 1914, the State Water Commission regulates surface water, with the exception of riparian water rights and pre-1914 appropriative water rights. That's determined by the courts. 1914 to the present, the law continues to refine, that was my handy word, water rights, which other people describe as the water wars. And then from 1914 to 2014, there's this 100-year gap with virtually no government regulation of groundwater. You had adjudicated basins, or you had some kind of efforts to gather data, but there was no regulation. So the significance of this magnificent act is really amazing, and we need to celebrate it. And I sort of like to say, don't waste a drought, because I really know that that act was able to get through the legislature after all these years and with the governor's signature, because people began to realize the threats that they had. So SGMA provides a framework for sustainable management of groundwater by local authorities, and if local authorities don't do it, the state will. It requires formation of local groundwater sustainability agencies. How many of you are currently engaged in doing a GSA? It's fun, isn't it? And then also it requires adoption of locally based groundwater sustainability plans. So SGMA is part of a comprehensive water policy strategy that the state has and promotes. And as Judy was talking about, water use efficiency, water conservation, water recycling, expanded water storage, my preference is groundwater, that is a bias, and then safe drinking water, wetlands, and watershed restoration. So now what? Well, what are the opportunities for land use planning and integrated water management in SGMA? Land use has a direct relationship with reliable water supply, water quality, and flood management, and groundwater recharge. Land use resource management strategies are the most reliable, cost-effective, and sustainable tool available, and the least used. So when what Judy was referring to earlier in terms of sprawl, that is an extremely costly thing to do in terms of water management, and we're going to talk a little bit more about ways to avoid those costs and what some of the tools are that we have today. Where we want to start first in land use is for folks to really understand how the system works. There's watershed, there's drainage, there's percolation. All of those are integral and for the system, for us to actually have a reliable water supply, for the environment to thrive, and for fish to be able to have water to swim in. We need water certainly for municipal and industrial uses and for agriculture. All of this is dependent on the functioning of physical systems of the watershed and, as I said, the streams. So the opportunities for groundwater management, first of all, there are some cities that depend on groundwater. How many of your cities depend on groundwater to some degree? Right, that's really important. So sustaining that, making it sustainable is really critical. The update for the urban water management plan, which is due this year, 2016, your staffs are working on that. They're probably paying way too much money for engineers to come up with the same thing that they came up with 5 years ago, only they updated the data. I'm really frustrated with the engineering approach on the urban water management planning process because it really needs to engage the public so they understand where the resources are, how they're being managed, what the relationship is. That's a planning function. So we in Solano County, I was inspired by Santa Clara Valley Water District because they have kind of a unified urban water management plan, and it's one document that represents all the cities and the county. And I wanted my county, Solano County, to do the same thing. A lot of things are uphill battle in Solano County, and this was one of them. But I was very fortunate to have a new general manager with our Solano County Water Agency, and he actually helped promote the concept of at least having a single document with all the cities' data and showing how the water was used. And at the end of that, they realized that they could save money. So we're full bore now into doing this, what I call unified document. And then groundwater should be integrated where with the flood management that you do identify in your other programs. So here's another tool. It's a really great tool. It's a result of some long years of hard work and then ultimately some legislation, reform legislation in 2007. Flood management is the operative word for what we can do with groundwater recharge. And another reason why you don't want to put people at risk, but you also don't want to cover over the groundwater recharge areas. And so by using flood management, which is kind of a public safety approach, it can inspire local decision makers to do the two things. And at the end of the day, being safe from flooding without doing major structural efforts, and then also recharging your groundwater means you are going toward compact development. So here's an example of flood management, and the urban area actually is protected by what I call soft infrastructure for protecting those urban areas. That's a huge area, by the way. Local and state government roles are that local government has the primary responsibility for land use decision-making. There are state goals, policies, and some direction, a few standards, not enough. Keep working on that part. And then integrated water management is the underlying philosophy behind what we're trying to promote, which is the concept that you have a series of things that you can do, multiple objectives. So it's more than integrated regional water management, which is a program that is actually implementing this philosophy of integrated water management. The state, local government should actually participate in regional efforts because your political boundaries actually are just that, political boundaries. They don't recognize the hydrologic and some of the other factors. The state does have an important role in terms of occasional regulation and standard, and so SB 610 and 221 are essentially show me the water. I mentioned the flood legislation. And then the Strategic Growth Council has the carrot through the grants, and it's becoming more and more effective in directing some of those land use decisions for water management. This is the 2003, but as you know, it's being updated, and that update is going to have, I promised, an optional element for water. When a local government adopts an optional element in the general plan, it is no longer optional, it then becomes the law of the general plan. There have been mixed thoughts about the value of this. I've sort of started over here thinking about it should be cross-cutting on the general plan. I'm over here now thinking we need to have a separate element. And then also OPR wisely looked at the approach of looking at the whole watershed, and then through the document they provide tools and approaches that helps the local government see how they can consider the watershed in their planning, whether they're in a small hydrologic unit or a large watershed. Here's the California Water Plan, which is the thing I work on my part-time basis, and the land use section. This is to achieve sustainable outcomes. Gives lots of choices, but with a sustainable outcome as a goal. The water plan is required by law, started in 1957, and it's updated every 5 years. The next one will be, 2018 will be very different. It won't be like it's been for the last 15 years. There's a strong nexus with the Governor's Water Action Plan. If you don't want to do a water plan, it's a large document. Read the Governor's Water Action Plan, orient your programs so they incorporate that. And it's a tool for guiding investment priorities as well. So I think I'm going to skip through this. This is the core message of the California Water Plan. This is a stakeholders list of tools that Judy was referring to that have emerged over the years. This list started off as fairly modest and it has grown to about 30. You will notice that land use planning and management is in red. That's because this is my slide. This is not in the actual water plan. Land use is the center of the universe. So once we get that concept, then we can do all these other things. And then for the first time ever, since 1957, there's actually a land use objective in the California Water Plan. And it has a series of actions, of recommendations that can be done. So if you kind of want to know how to write your water element, that will be optional. It's optional now, actually. You can be guided by those, I can't remember, 17 action items that go along with the 15 objectives. Clearly, we're aiming for compact development to reduce water demand, to improve water quality, limit development in floodplains and groundwater recharge areas, reduce water-related infrastructure costs and maintenance, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because you shorten the water processing, you shorten the amount of water that's being used. That means less energy. That means reducing greenhouse gases. And then, of course, preserve agricultural lands. So, why I like being mayor? Anyway, his point is that things happen at the local government level. We can move faster, we're more nimble, we can work on the ground, we have stakeholders, we can move pretty fast. One of the reasons I shifted my career over to being an elected official. And then this is a tool that we developed at DWR to help local, to actually test a concept we have, which is to demonstrate differences in water use at the lot and neighborhood level, and then show hardscape as a critical component to minimizing water resource impacts. Shows the importance of low impact development, demonstrates the high cost of business as usual, development for operations and maintenance. And that's a key word, operation and maintenance. People don't really recognize how much it does cost. And so we wanted to show that after 20, 50, 100 years, this is what it's really going to cost you to build those things, to deal with that development, rather than to do some of the things that we were talking about earlier. So the objective is to create an accessible tool to help guide land use decision making and quantify the relationship of land cover, water supply benefits, and cost at case study sites. All of them were in Sonoma. Thank you, Sonoma. And we now we're updating it. And we have a new batch of students, and we have a new relationship with Sonoma Water Agency, and we also have a new relationship with Sonoma State. This is a typical Excel spreadsheet. It's open source. You can download it. You can play with it. You can put different numbers in there. It's actually much longer than this, of course, but this is easily done today. It has automatic. That was not my finger. The tool outputs are cost of implementation. The cost is set over 50 or 100 years. We actually added 20 and 25. We were getting a lot of questions from decision makers that they said, well, why do you go out 50 or 100 years? And we said, well, because the executive order says 50 at the state level and 100 at the federal level. But we did change that, so that's new. Our conclusions, this tool enables people without technical background to more easily assess the impacts of different development choices. And as I said in the beginning, as an elected official, working with electeds, I started as a planning director and I worked my way up. And I could see the kind of the general decision-making framework that my colleagues were using and use. And so this is really where the idea came from, and we asked some of the best and the brightest in the state, Bob is one of them, to develop this tool. So it projects with reduced hardscapes, smaller building footprints, and less elaborate infrastructure requirements are more likely to yield the most economical design, from water supply to runoff and everything in between. Maintenance costs are hard to document right now, although we're getting better at it. That's why we're updating the tool with new data, because we've had more low-impact development on the books and operating, and so we've got better data for that. We can do this, you guys. It's hard work. It's fun. Join with us in making sure that we can implement these tools and better land use decisions for the benefit of water. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson, for pointing out some of the strategies that our local policymakers can use to engage in this issue and some of the tools that they can use to do so. Just so you're all aware, all of the presentations will be made available online following the conference, so you can review them or send them to your staff to follow up on all of the different tools and resources that are highlighted. Next, we have the pleasure of hearing from Trevor Joseph from DWR, and he's going to provide us a high-level overview of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and what you all can do to engage on it. If we learned anything from Mayor Patterson's presentation, it's that water in California is complicated, and Sigma just adds another layer of complexity. So I hope you can break it down for us.
Great, thank you. Everybody hear me okay? Been down here a little bit. So thank you for inviting me today. This is my first time to this conference, and I knew of the Awami Principles. I'm not a planner per se, I'm a hydrogeologist, but I didn't realize that it had been already 25 years. It seems like when I saw references to it, it must have been only 5-10 years ago. So time does move by quickly. Today I want to focus on a little bit of background on statewide hydrogeology and statewide hydrology, groundwater conditions. I think this group's probably familiar with this, but it helps set the stage in terms of how the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act came into play and kind of the importance of the Act. And then I'll touch on the Act itself and also the Department of Water Resources, the department that I work for, our role in implementing the Act. And there's a lot of new terminology, and I'll try to keep it at a fairly high level. I was going to mention a couple of things, but they've already been mentioned, and it's kind of rare, I think. I shouldn't say rare, but it's not always the case where planners have such a strong understanding of groundwater and surface water. So when I saw Mayor Patterson's surface water equals groundwater, that was actually going to be my line. There is no groundwater without surface water. I think folks have a tendency to think that just groundwater comes and goes. It's all obviously related to surface water. Again, you're well familiar with this, but the vast majority of the runoff occurs north of the delta. Approximately 2/3 of the distribution of water or excuse me, 80% of the distribution of water is north of the delta and about 20% south. And then in terms of water use, obviously it's almost the opposite. About 2/3 of the water use is south of the delta and 1/3 is north of the delta. For groundwater, this is from our California Water Plan. The groundwater equates to about 40% of the statewide water use on an average annual basis, with the exception of drought years where it goes way up, and it can be up to 60% of water use. What I'd like to show here is just by hydrologic region how dependent some of these areas are on groundwater. For example, the Central Coast, although they don't use a large volume statewide, they are 86% reliant on groundwater in terms of their total water supply, so they're heavily reliant. And then of course the Central Valley has the highest groundwater use, especially Tulare Lake hydrologic region and San Joaquin River hydrologic region. So these black dots, these are our dot maps, they show water levels, and the black dots represent the lowest water levels that we have on history of record. And this dates back a little bit to 2014, but obviously during the drought, that water levels statewide really, but definitely in the Central Valley, in many cases are at their lowest levels, or in most cases are at their lowest levels. And this has changed then the amount of storage, groundwater storage. So there's been then obviously an evacuation of the groundwater supply and a change in storage. And so this just illustrates again in the Central Valley, the darker or the warmer colors, I should say, are the most amount of storage change, but there's been a lot of storage. And again, this dates back, we haven't updated this to the 2010-15 conditions, which would take into account the drought and would look even worse. But there's been a lot of groundwater storage change in the Central Valley in particular. And all of this has resulted into different effects, whether it's to domestic water supply, ag supply, municipal, you name it, but also subsidence. And as you're aware, the Central Valley has seen kind of a renewed subsidence. Now the visual on the left is maybe the most overused photograph to describe subsidence or show subsidence, and that dates back to studies and the data from the 70s. But there is, again, renewed subsidence based on all those changing water levels in the Central Valley. And of course, that creates problems. You once had a surface water canal system that's gravity fed, and now it doesn't flow, in that direction anymore. In addition, changes to land uses such as homes and infrastructure, railroads. So it's a major cause of concern. So moving forward then, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. As Mayor Patterson mentioned, I believe that the drought had a big role in that, as well as looking at all these conditions that are occurring. East Porterfield, these communities that are heavily dependent on water, groundwater that no longer have groundwater, has led to this act. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, really the central feature though is that groundwater is best accomplished locally. So local government. This is unlike some other countries or even states where it's more of a top-down type of legislation. Here, it's really up to the locals to manage groundwater, and if they can't, then the state would step in. So, and again, this was covered by Mayor Patterson very well, but the groundwater management has not been mandatory up till the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Before 2015, it's been a voluntary system of laws that was incentivized by grants, as you know, and now we move to require groundwater management, and it requires that the entire basin be covered, not just kind of pockets or areas of folks that are more progressive on groundwater, managing groundwater. And then there's the state board backstop, and I'll get into that in a minute. But I work for the Department of Water Resources. We're the good cop. We're the ones that will tell you whether or not, well, maybe we're the good cop. We're the ones that will tell you whether or not these plans are sustainable. But if they're not, the state board will come in, the sister agency, and they'll take over managing groundwater until that area, somebody can reemerge and manage groundwater effectively. So here's, again, these three roles. Department of Water Resources, we're the evaluation agency as it relates to these new groundwater sustainability plans that Mayor Patterson briefly mentioned. We're also providing technical assistance. We pride ourselves on trying to provide world-class technical information and data, and we really need to up our game to help locals out, providing especially statewide data sets. As I mentioned, the state boards, the enforcement arm, and then these new groundwater sustainability agencies, and it's interesting to know that folks are already moving along in that direction, but you're really have the largest role, the planning and implementation. Ultimately, that's the hardest job here, is the GSA role. Stakeholder involvement kind of encompasses all of this, but ultimately it's the GSA's, the locals' role to manage groundwater that's going to be the most challenging. So there was a lot of items of intent that came along with the legislation. I'm not going to go through them all here. They're all kind of equally good. Increased groundwater storage. As we're hearing today, groundwater recharge, incredibly important to maintain storage and increase storage where you can. Avoiding that subsidence, again, avoiding those impacts is obviously paramount to the intent of this law. So where does this apply? Well, most of the groundwater basins in the state. There's 127 high and medium priority groundwater basins. They're shown here in orange and yellow. They represent 96% of the groundwater supply, and then 88% of the population that overlies groundwater basins. So there are 515 groundwater basins or subbasins statewide, but the vast majority of those what are called low or very low priority basins are in areas where there's very little groundwater use and there's not quite as many impacts to be concerned about. So trying to characterize how the Act's going to be implemented in one slide is challenging. So I've broken out in these phases, and they may or may not make sense, or we may abandon this if we can't make sense of it. But phase one, I feel, has always been kind of about realigning governance in areas. And not completely realigning, but these new GSAs need to form. That's in the law. And so there's a certain amount of time for local agencies to identify themselves as groundwater sustainability agencies to take control of future groundwater management of certain basins. Then the phase two is this development of these new groundwater sustainability plans. And there's a series of years to do that. And it's a little shorter if you're in a basin that's been deemed critically in overdraft. You have a little less time. But otherwise, you have till 2022 to prepare a groundwater sustainability plan. The third phase is really kind of the most groundbreaking or new phase. And this is where Judy mentioned, it has teeth. Now water budgets will be a requirement. And that hasn't really been done universally before. There are certainly those progressive agencies and groundwater management entities that have done water budgets. There are many out there, but a requirement statewide to actually have an accounting system of the inputs and outputs, this is really where it will be real in terms of how much supply and availability of groundwater is there for managing. And then these entities have 20 years to implement these plans and reach sustainability. And so the sustainability needs to be reached either by 2040 or 42. So there is recognition that we can't turn things around on a dime and that there's time to avoid these impacts that are identified in the Act and implement this program. So the program, and I'm going to focus a little more on what the department's doing, but it certainly relates to what the locals need to start to think about. This is just our strategic plan. We put this out about a year ago. It's a fairly easy read. It's about 30 pages or so. It just describes what the department's doing in terms of implementing the Act. And then it has that nexus to the California Water Action Plan, as Mayor Patterson mentioned. We've had to address, or develop, I should say, a series of regulations rather quickly, emergency regulations. And so we quickly identified some advisory groups, 11 advisory groups, and other organizations to really get early input on what will be a workable regulation. I mean, ultimately, our regulations need to result in sustainable groundwater management, but we put a lot of effort, had 60 or more meetings with these advisory groups to talk through what are the issues, what are they looking to see in these regulations, how can we potentially incorporate some of that information. At the same time, we recognize we're not going to make everybody happy with this regulation, but we spend a lot of time on advisory group input, and for our perspective, it's been incredibly important and successful. So the department, I mentioned the locals have ultimately the hardest role in SGMA, and that's true. However, I feel the department has a really hard role right now because we have to kind of set up all the rules of the game, if you will, through these regulations and a series of technical items. And so here's a list of just what the department's been doing just in terms of SGMA implementation that doesn't include everything else that kind of Mayor Patterson mentioned in terms of what the department's also doing just for water management. And I was just going to focus just real briefly on the GSA formation and the GSP emergency regulations. So, what is a GSA and a GSP? GSA means one or more local agencies that can implement the Act. They must be a local agency. There's been a lot of questions in terms of whether tribes or different stakeholders or even municipal water companies could be a GSA, and they can. There's another role for them in terms of being included in stakeholder involvement, but ultimately a GSA must be a local agency. And then GSPs are these new plans, essentially these new groundwater management plans. And as I mentioned, GSPs need to cover the entire basin or subbasin of all those 127 basins or subbasins that I identified previously. And they can do it in different ways. There can be multiple GSPs that cover a basin or subbasin, or it can just be one GSP. There can be multiple GSAs that come together through an agreement, or there can just be one GSA. So there is some flexibility, but I recognize from a local level how challenging it is to reach agreement in terms of how to manage and kind of identify who's going to utilize which portion of the basin. As of today, we have 64 GSAs that have provided a notification or formation notice to the department. That's our role here. Our role with the department is not to enter in as an intermediary between disputes in terms of who's the real GSA if they have overlap. Overlap cannot occur. That's when two local agencies, maybe such as a county or water district, both want to be the GSA for that area. That's ultimately up to them to figure out and sort out. The department has no role in sorting that out. We're just posting all that information on our website and shown here on our interactive map. So now I'm going to quickly switch to GSP Emergency Regulations. Now this is the kind of the granddaddy of all the projects that we have to work on, because it's really the most important. It's where the teeth really are in terms of what agencies will need to do to manage groundwater. And it needs to be adopted through the commission by June 1st, 2016. So we're kind of in the final couple of hours of implementing this project. We're getting close. We have a draft emergency regulation that we posted on February 18th. We're in a comment period right now. The comment period was just extended yesterday from March 25th to April 1st. That's only another week, but that's all the fat that we have in the schedule. We have to take this information, evaluate all the public comments that we received on this draft regulation, and then prepare a final, recommended final for the commission for potentially the May meeting, which of course is coming up soon. These are just the articles in the regulation. I want to highlight that planned contents is where the land use and other plan kind of connections section of the regulation exists. There's requirements of essentially how a groundwater sustainability plan takes into account land use planning, both within the basin and outside the basin. So there's a lot of important provisions in that section as it relates to land use planning. So to try to describe the regulations then in one slide, which is almost impossible, but I'll try to do it quickly. There's these 6 items that need to be avoided. They're called undesirable results if they're significant or reasonable. A lot of new terminology. We came up with these kind of snappy little icons that don't completely make sense in some cases. If seawater intrusion is not tsunami, I was actually working on that. But as you can't see groundwater, it's always hard to create visuals for groundwater. But anyway, surface water depletion, reduction of storage, degraded water quality, land subsidence, lowering groundwater levels, seawater intrusion, all of those items are potentially impacts, but only if they're at significant or reasonable levels. And that significant or reasonable level should be locally proposed through a stakeholder process, considering beneficial uses and users of water. And so that's where that locally, bottom-up, if you will, approach to what is the best way to manage water, groundwater, to avoid these items should be done. But we want to see your homework. We want to see how you've developed those thresholds, how you're going to measure and monitor those groundwater conditions, and then what projects are you going to use to reach sustainability. And a lot of these are showcasing recharge projects, and that's actually somewhat close to my heart, because in consulting I did a lot of surface spreading and aquifer storage and recovery type programs. And it really comes down to either demand reduction or supply augmentation. And so for many of these areas that are out of balance, out of water balance, they're really going to have to work at some recharge projects, again, or demand reduction in order to reach sustainability over the long term. So with that, final slide or two. Just this, I think I mentioned this as it relates to the GSP draft emergency regulations. These are some big dates for us. And with that, if you're interested, we have a website. It's a little confusing. There's a California groundwater website, and then there's the department's website that has a kind of a lot more information. The California groundwater website has studies also provided by the state board and others. But if you're interested in updates in terms of what we're developing, please get on our email distribution list. Thank you.